Right. Well, we're going to start this afternoon's session talking about Asian mining investment opportunities. And we have a splendid panel here for you to take you through some of the key countries in the region and talk about some of the opportunities and risks involved in investing in mining in Asia. To my immediate left here, we have a partner at Bromius Capital, Mr. Bhagyesh Dash. Bhagyesh, welcome. We have, in the middle there, we have Edward Gusali, who is Managing Director at Penida Capital, based in Indonesia. And then on the end, we have Jorge Ramiro Monroy, who is a Director of EMC, which stands for Emerging Markets Capital. Jorge is based in Hong Kong. But Jorge, where are you from originally? You're from Mexico, that's right. Okay, so Jorge's from Mexico, but based in Hong Kong. We see him a lot up there in Hong Kong. So welcome to our panel. A quick round of applause for our panel. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I want to sort of talk about some of the key countries, key mining countries in this part of the world. And I think we'll start... I'd like to start maybe with Indonesia. And let's just start with Edward. You're based there in Jakarta. Tell us, first of all, just a little bit, tell us a little bit about Penida Capital, what you do and what you're doing in Indonesia.
Sure.
But then also update us on what's happening in terms of regulation and policy in Indonesia.
Okay. Well, thank you for that kind of introduction, and I'll try not to put any of you to sleep after that fine lunch. Penida Capital, I've been in Indonesia now 26 years. We've been around just as long. We're an investment advisory and private equity firm. We invest in a number of asset classes, and we have so in the mining sector, where we got our first start actually in Australia, looking at distressed plays and rolling them up into opportunities to then, after a few years of putting some fit and finishes and getting them profitable, selling them off. In Indonesia, we advise a number of our clients are in the mining sector. Some are looking for expansionary capital because of consolidation plays taking place. Others are looking to divest for diversification reasons. And in addition to that, we serve as advisors to the Indonesia Central Bank, Ministry of Finance, and Indonesia's version of the SEC on the whole digital economy space and how to particularly apply it to the mining sector using blockchain, fintech, digital currencies in that aspect. So there's a lot of interesting things going on. To the point that I was asked to talk about where is current play or situation in Indonesia. Last week, we were a part of a policy and discussion with the government with regards to its new draft revisions to the mining and minerals law, which is being put forth for a vote in Parliament. And the gist of it all is, and you'll see it in the region and other countries, is this, for lack of a better term, nationalization movement toward ensuring that the government, on behalf of its taxpayers and people, do control what's under their feet. And that Indonesia, in that regards, in that movement away from kind of wonton, you have full control, to you're being told now you must enter into joint ventures with state-owned enterprises, is a part of that movement we see in the region. Now, most of the discussion and dialogue of the players there, both from operation, exploration, and development, wasn't so much uneasiness. They understand that now and then Indonesia will try to move the goalposts, get a better deal. But, you know, my experience has always been when those discussions happen, it's usually the timing is off. And in many ways, it's not what you say, but how you say it that counts, which Indonesia is still learning to match its promotion of we want more investment versus matching it with the regulations. So this misconnect is, I think, still there, only simply because who drafted those regulations, it was definitely a political drafting. It was various parties going in and saying, okay, well, we want to divvy up the resources, and Indonesia being as large as it is, almost 17,000 islands, the largest democracy, and it is after the United States. And it's certainly trying to get away from a economy which is driven by the mining sector and resource sector to a more diversified economy, which we're beginning to see. Everything they're doing does make sense, but it's the storytelling and convincing capital formation to come in and get behind that story. And so some of the comments that myself and our other partners volunteered to saying, you know, we understand the new methodology. We understand you want more visibility and transparency across this whole sector, which is why you're asking for joint ventures with locally held enterprises by both the central and local governments. We get that. But in the end, there's nothing in this regulation which speaks to encouraging or incentivizing exploration. Where the regulations reach is basically how you're going to divide the pie of existing assets which are depleting. Nothing about encouragement or the capital formation or the intellectual property that goes behind that. And you know, the Indonesian authorities were very respectful and saying, yes, you're right, we have misses, but that's not our cup of tea. This is something that Parliament has decided on, and will it pass or will it not? We don't know. I would say at this point, given that we're less than a year from presidential elections, I think we're going to have a pregnant pause where this is, in 2 weeks' time, they're going to have a vote on this. Whether it passes the way it does or not, we'll see. If it doesn't, everyone will be in a holding pattern until such time, as I like to tell people, let the Indonesians precipitate a crisis so that at the 11th hour, at the 11th minute, at the 11th second, something will come about that makes reasonable economic and prudential sense to the players.
So if it passes in Parliament, what does that mean for the future of, you know, international companies going in and doing exploration in Indonesia?
So I think it's going to do two things. One, it will consolidate the industry into those who are in the know or connected. You know, companies like Adaro and the others who definitely have a large footprint now and do have operational excellence, but because they have a local feel, they know how to navigate and find the best. I think it'll discourage any of the juniors from even entering, just because they're not going to have the capital or intimate understanding on how to get things done in a very timely fashion. I think it's going to stall the process, and maybe that is the unintended consequence that the government wants, which is if we continue to sell off the family silverware, we're not going to have anything in the next few years, so why don't we just kind of slow that process down and encourage other sectors of the economy, for example, the digital space, startups, how to connect the growth to poor and the poor to growth, where you have these small, medium enterprises which are not connected to the mining sector, but nonetheless are able to generate some additional value in that process. I think the big issue is managing expectations, and that is the government saying we want 5.8% economic growth when they're at about 5. We need additional tax revenues, and then we're going to soak all the resource sector in getting those new royalties and tax revenues. And they're just not focusing on the fact that you can never tax your country into prosperity. You know, at the end of the day, it's the private sector that generates wealth, and if they're not formulating new capital and new exploration and going after new opportunities, even recycling of old assets and giving some incentive to the risk that's involved in that, then I think we're going to be having this discussion a year from now and another revision to the law to saying, whoops, I think we maybe have overreached. Maybe we need to kind of take a step back and give some incentives.
What's your take on the chances of it passing?
Well, from the audience in the room from the private sector, everyone said they don't see it passing. Now, having said that, we don't know. Anything can happen in Indonesia. If it does pass, I just think it's just going to be an affirmation of this was done for political expediency, and then it's that, whoops, no one's taking up on this. Why would I underwrite a brand new state-owned enterprise that has no expertise in exploration or operations or development, their sole purpose is to be my local partner to collect rent from me. I just don't see how that's going to be any advantage or incentive to encourage players to come in.
Bhagesh, any thoughts on Indonesia as a mining investment destination?
Look, I don't disagree with anything that Ed said, and I agree with most of the points that you've made. One thing I would say is that I moved to Indonesia in '93, and back then there were only a handful of local investors or local mining groups. Most of the big boys like BHP, Rio Tinto were they were the guys driving the mining sector. Fast forward to 2018, 25 years onwards, there are very few foreign mining groups left in Indonesia. And I think what's happened is you've had what I call a private nationalization of the Indonesian mining sector, where local business groups have come in, they've taken advantage of some of the laws that were passed, and they've basically taken over the projects, to the point now where the foreign mining groups the big ones, have rushed out of the sector. Having said that, I think, and it's true with any business anywhere in the world, especially in the emerging world, if you want to do business in Indonesia, be it Mexico, Philippines, for a foreign investor, small junior mining group, the best thing to do is partner up with a local partner. Because the reality is that Indonesia, especially Indonesia, doesn't have exploration expertise. And that is what they need, and that's what they've been lacking. An example is Nusantara Resources. They're backed by the Lion Select guys. They bought a gold project in Indonesia, and they partnered with a pretty large Indonesian group, and they've managed to float on the ASX. I believe they will move that project forward. I don't know what the interest for that company will be in Australia, but I do believe that with the likes of Lion Select, they've generated interest for that project. But otherwise, what you're going to have is you're going to have a lot of large local groups who will get bigger. So Merdeka Copper and Gold, $800 million company now, listed on the JSX. And that's the development in Indonesia. And I think that's the same, and Jorge can probably tell us more about the Philippines as well. Again, Philippines was a place, Philippines has had a mixed track record, of course, but you had a lot of foreign mining groups in there, but then in the last 10 years, you had a lot of the large local groups moving in and taking over foreign-controlled projects.
But given that so many Indonesian companies are now, Indonesian-based mining companies now Indonesian-owned and listed on the JSX, are you going to see Jakarta emerge as a more important mining stock exchange going forward, place for raising money for projects in Indonesia?
Again, they'll be raised for local content. I mean, anyone who has a regional play will be looking at more of an exposure to, say, Singapore or Hong Kong in that context, or Australia. But I think Bhagesh's points are correct. You're seeing consolidation take place, and again, that's a good thing, because if you remember a few years ago, we had over 10,000 IUPs, which were the mining contracts issued, and it was basically a rush to essentially assemble $2 million to get a contract and then try to flip it through your Singapore lawyers at a higher price. Well, we've seen those 10,000 IUPs go down to, I think, 3,000, and they're trying to get it down to a few hundred, which again is a good thing, because if you're going to be in this game, you have to be well capitalized, you have to have operational excellence, you have to have the environmental standards and visibility as to how you run your operations. And I think that's always been the aim or the goal of the Indonesian government from the policy. But what we tend to see is the teething process in implementation, because although those laws have been there, they've never been implemented. So you always get this kind of bitter aftertaste. Well, why are you enforcing it now when you wrote it back in 2009? I'm a little taken aback, as to why that is. Today, I think it's going to be written this way, and we want to actually enforce the rules of engagement. And if you don't like, well, maybe Indonesia is not for you, as Bhagesh has indicated. I think it's still a good play from a sense of looking at exploration. I mean, if you say lithium, cobalt, scandium, or any of these rare earth elements, you're going to get people interested. But yet, there's been no discussion of that. We're still focusing on recycling of existing assets in Indonesia, and yet those would be the opportunities, I would think, that you would want to encourage new exploration or new capital formation around, and give some positivity to the Indonesian government that we are open for business under this new structure, but for these opportunities, and basically get those animal spirits going again.
Nickel as well, which is a significant component in electric batteries, and Indonesia is big on nickel resources.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the Philippines and bring Jorge in here. Give us your thoughts on where the Philippines is at in terms of encouraging investment into mining or discouraging it.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, basically, we have a project in the Philippines in Mindanao, which is a nickel exploration project, and we got in it about 2 years before the last election, and we have a Japanese partner for that project, and it's been an absolute disaster. As we were talking before with Bagiesh, the new president Duterte brought in hardcore environmentalists as the Secretary of Mining, and she basically canceled all the open pit mining permits. A lot of the large mining companies in the Philippines were able to keep going, and I think partly because they have a lot of jobs. But in terms of exploration and new projects, everything has basically been stalled. It was already bad enough with the previous administration, but unfortunately, it seems like they actually replaced, under a lot of pressure from the mining industry, they replaced the old mining minister, who was this lady, and they've now brought in a new minister. But it's actually, I think the president himself is anti-mining, and I've been looking at this, of course, with a lot of interest and going to the Philippines and talking to a number of players, and it's very difficult for me to tell exactly what's going on and what's behind this anti-mining movement. I think, well, he claims it's for environmental reasons. You know how it is in these countries. I really don't know what's going on, but basically halfway through his presidency, I mean, he's grind the mining industry to a halt. From our perspective, we have a very strong Philippines partner, and in terms of investment opportunities, if you have a little bit of a longer term horizon, there are a lot of mining properties that have had substantial exploration and work done on them that people are basically willing to give it to you for essentially for free. So on a longer term horizon, there's definitely those opportunities, and we're looking a lot at that. Now the mining ministry is basically completely halted, so even executing a transaction is very questionable as to whether you can take a license from somebody else, because in the previous administration they were already reviewing the mining code, and it was a lot of aspects of it were halted. So it's not a great panorama. That being said, and similar to what Bagiesh was mentioning, I have a feeling if something dramatic happens in the nickel supply chain, I think that could trigger something quite interesting both in Indonesia and the Philippines. Because at the end of the day, between Philippines and Indonesia, the nickel cobalt is a very substantial part of the supply chain, and I think that could cause, if all of a sudden we see a very tight supply for these commodities and see prices go up dramatically, I just don't think the governments of those two countries are going to leave that money on the table, and I think you'll see either an exception or some fast track of changing the law. Now, in the Philippines, there's from the new government a big push to try to get local content, and similar to what Indonesia did, they're saying, okay, we won't give you a license to do direct ship ore, but if you can put together something where you'll build a smelter here and you can process the ore here, people are saying, and it's not official, but there's a Singaporean group trying to do a feasibility study on a ferronickel smelter, and they're doing a very serious attempt with a local Philippines party that's a partner that's very connected to the current government. So I think opportunities like that may emerge, but by and large, it's a very, very difficult situation.
But if you've got, long time horizon.
Yeah, and like say for instance, for a group like ours, which is basically in essence is private capital, and for the Philippines family that we're working with, it makes a lot of sense because you could take these properties for very, very cheap. It costs you, the holding costs are not tremendous, and then see what happens in the next precedent comes up. I think the Philippines has something, and in some extent similar to Indonesia, but I think more dramatic in the Philippines, where it's when you go visit these mines, a lot of it is, like say, the open pit in a very unregulated, laxly regulated environmentally, and then a lot of rain. It is a recipe for disaster. You see a lot of floods, and then the tailings dam break. Somebody was telling me. Actually, I went to meet the Ministry of Mining in the Philippines. This lady that we were talking about, and she was telling me that over the past 60 years of mining in the Philippines, any mine that has closed has never been reclaimed. So I think they do have some genuine concerns environmentally. But it's, I really can't figure out what's going on there. And I don't know if Bagiesh has more insight than me.
No, but that being said, Oceana Gold has been quite a success
Yes.
story in the Philippines.
Yes, and I think the big companies that are there, I think Masbate and B2Gold, I think at the end of the day, I think those companies will be okay. I think it's more bringing an exploration project, like say, that has a big open pit component. I think it's going to be great, and even any bigger project like what's the South African company? Gold, which one?
Harmony?
No, not Harmony, but sorry, I'm blacking out on the name. But they have a big copper open pit, copper gold porphyry that they've been trying to move forward, and they just can't get anywhere.
But I think, I would, Jorge, you would categorize your company as being foreign capital combined with local partner, isn't it?
Well, actually, in Philippines, for the kind of smaller investments like the one we have, you have to have a 60% partner. However, the partner that we have, who's the majority, is a Filipino family.
Which goes to the point, in response to your question, I think the best way for foreign investors to participate in these markets is by aligning themselves with a good local partner, which is no different to anywhere else in the world in any other businesses.
And I guess with the question, how do you find a good local partner? Spend a lot of time in country and...
I was fascinated. I was fascinated with Jorge's discussion on how things just stopped in their tracks, and the only thing I can think of that is such an about face would to essentially negate Chinese adventurism into the mining sector, and that is, we're going to put a hold to everyone, but the real intention is to not have the dominance of China's state-owned enterprises come into this sector and truly exploit without a care for environmental or even work standards. That's the only thing I can think of. I mean, we've seen China come into the resource space in Indonesia and set up a mining town and a port facility and power generation, and from A to Z, and they do it very quick and they do it very fast. But you go to that site, and the Indonesians will say, "Oh my God, we didn't realize it was going to be this big," and have these many people from mainland China working at site. And so maybe the thought process is stop it in its tracks. Let's take a pregnant pause, find out what's going on, and rework it in such a way with following ASEAN neighbors. What's the best deal where you do have a combination of thoughtful, ESG capital coming in, and some standards with local partners who are willing to play by those rules.
Look, I can comment on that in relation to the Philippines because China does not look at Philippines as a friendly country to invest in. So, because of the Spratly Islands issue. So, China was not an issue for the Philippines. I think Philippines is quite unique in that way, what they've done. I think, again, but going back, in terms of geological endowment, there are no better places than Indonesia, Philippines, when it comes to all the main commodities. I know in one of your panels, it was John or Robert Ed talking about copper. And if you're talking about copper, Indonesia, Philippines, PNG are the three biggest places in this part of the world, besides Australia.
Absolutely. And tying into your point earlier about China, Edward, brings us nicely, I think, to Mongolia, which obviously over the years has had a lot of hype about it, and then again stopped in its tracks when the Chinese said that they wanted to buy the South Gobi project, and they went, "Hang on, wait a sec." So, thoughts on where Mongolia is right now? Elections coming up.
Yeah, so I lived in Mongolia for a year during the boom in the 2011, and it's quite sad to see where the decline that they've had. They're sort of having a bit of a resurgence now. There was actually a big transaction, and I didn't check the news to see if it closed, but it seems like a company called Step Gold out of Toronto is doing a 20 million IPO in the TSX, which is, I think, for that type of company, is quite a large IPO. And last I heard, the book was going to fill. I didn't see if they actually finish. And there's 4 or 5 companies that are. There's one here, Xanadu, that I like that asset quite a bit. But in terms of local regulation and local mining law, there's still, Congress every few months, somebody puts forward a new law to try to increase the taxes from mining companies, try to increase the taxes from exploration. I think risk reward wise, when you look at something like Step Gold that's going to go on the IPO, I was interested in doing an investment into that. But when I looked at the valuation and then the risk, the grade, and then you look at the opportunities you have in jurisdictions like Canada or even Australia, it's very tough. It was actually impossible for me to get myself to do the placement because I just where we're in the market, I personally don't see them being able to go back to the interest that they had in 2011. They've changed rules on investments on investors way too many times. They have very little infrastructure, high cost of electricity, and again, similar to what Bhagesh was saying, the geological endowment is staggering, but I think it's still you need to see a lot higher prices for commodities and a real change in the government before you can see investors going back in.
Let's talk about, we've had some sort of 3 fairly negative countries there that we've sort of said it's very difficult, but geologically fantastic. Is there anywhere in the region that you think, is showing new promise, new hope, the place to go?
For me, nothing really stands out other than you go where capital feels welcome. From our perspective, and that's usually sanctity of contract and rule of law. So if you look at the region, who has the best track record, under those matrix, and then you look at, sanctity, contract, rule of law, capital formation is welcomed here. And then you start looking at, what is it that I'm interested in and who are the operators and anything else that goes with Pickering Local Partners and due diligence. But in our mind, I don't see anyone in the region just knocking it out of the park to saying we're just bending over backwards to have you all come in here. This is a generational process, and I think in a lot of these new emerging democracies, they're going through the same thought process and the same teething process that all democracies go in, which is we've got a 5-year presidential election cycle. New people come in, they want to find a way to squeeze what they can to get some benefit out of funding their elections. They may change things on the fringes, or they may go really deep in and you know, throw a Molotov cocktail into the whole thing and see how people scramble. I think that's just a game of leverage. And you know, I can tell you from the United States, we have a president who understands that game. And unfortunately, I think it's somehow percolating in some respects, or reaffirming, absolutely, you have the right to change your laws and regulations. You're a sovereign. But that doesn't make capital feel welcome, and it certainly doesn't help confidence in the sanctity of contract or enforcing the rule of law.
We had a presentation earlier today, obviously, from Japan Gold. Japan is in Asia. You know, when we think of these things, we often think of emerging markets, but you have, you know, South Korea, you have Japan in the mix.
I can tell you, about a year and a half ago, my broker in Canada invited me to do a placement in a company that's here called Japan Gold. And I said, well, that sounds a little bit crazy, but you know, I looked at the presentation and you know, I just put in a small amount of money, just sort of try to get to know what's going on here. And I've been you know, looking at it, and I think it's actually quite an interesting jurisdiction. I actually didn't know that they actually changed the mining law 2 years ago. And if you look at the mining code, it's actually very similar to, you know, the Canadian and Australian mining code. They have a number of historic deposits. About 4 years ago, I had been to a conference organized by JOGMEC. And as part of that conference, they gave us a tour of Sumitomo mine that's about 2 hours out of Tokyo. And it's an amazing mine. The head grade is underground mine mining 40 grams per ton gold as their head grade. And you know, when you're going down the ramp, and you know, you feel like at one, you know, the next turn you're gonna bump into a Louis Vuitton store, because you know, the way the decline is built is, you know, all concrete, and you know, the lights. I think if the big question in my mind is, can you really do environmental permitting the way it's been said? There's two companies in the TSX, Irving Resources and Japan Gold, who are, you know, doing exploration there. They've got their drill permits so far, so you know, at least exploration-wise, it seems like it's working. And if it does, then I think what's very interesting about it is that all of a sudden you would have a jurisdiction in Asia that has, you know, certainly rule of law. I think you've heard in the news they found a massive rare earths deposit in Japan, I guess found by the Japanese government. I think that one is one to watch. And again, I wouldn't you know, go rush and and you know, put all my money there. But if it works, I think it's quite an interesting jurisdiction.
How many foreign companies do you think the Japanese would tolerate?
Well, see, that's a really interesting question, because and that's also what people are saying, right? Like, I mean, Sumitomo is there, Mitsui, and these are very, very large companies. But if you look at it, they are, I mean, a company like Sumitomo, Mitsui, they don't really have exploration expertise. They typically go and, you know, they'll buy a share of, you know, 15, 20% in Lundin Mining. You know, they're partnering with Kinross, they're partnering with IAMGOLD in Canada, but they're always a minority partner and investor. They operate maybe 3-4 mines in Japan, in Alaska, Bolivia, but none of the Japanese are really exploration people. But it is actually and that's one of my biggest hesitations at the beginning was, I mean, why wouldn't these guys be exploring if, and Japanese are also, in a sense, very proud of their own, you know, of their own company. So are they going to tolerate a bunch of juniors from Canada and Australia, you know, making big discoveries? But, you know, at the end of the day, the demographics are, in Japan are going down. You see a lot of these mining towns where these companies are going to, and you know, there used to be towns that are basically deserted, not a lot of jobs for young people. I think it's definitely an interesting jurisdiction to watch and see what happens.
Absolutely. Any of the other panelists have any experience in Japan or South Korea?
No, none. The only thing I could say is that in the context of what we've discussed, there's a great opportunity for Japan to claim the title of most exciting exploration destination in Asia, Southeast Asia.
And most comfortable as well,
Most comfortable.
to be honest.
That was the
food.
whole point that we heard from Japan Gold, and it's like, well, who knew that? But then immediately, well, we know that you're going to get a fair shake, investing there.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of, what do the reserves look like? Are they able to move forward, make sure that there's not an orchestrated, NGO always propping up
Yeah.
to saying you can't do that, and the Japanese government being very sensitive to that.
Yeah.
And you'll certainly get rule of law, sorry.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, the other reason why I think this thesis has legs is, I mean, look at Japanese companies are very comfortable doing JVs with junior mining exploration companies. There's got to be at least 30, 40 that I can think of the top of my head, with assets all over the world. So I think again, like the concern about the environmental is huge. But some of these areas I was looking at the map are actually quite remote. They're not necessarily close to a populated area. I think if it was close to a populated area, it's going to be a contentious issue. And I have personally not spent a tremendous amount of time assessing that, but I'm definitely keeping my eyes open. It seems like a very interesting jurisdiction.
And certainly if it's bringing, jobs back to towns where there's just old ladies and, that's it.
No, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, some people might know I spent some time up in the north of Japan when I was younger, and some of those towns are dying, and they desperately need an injection of new life. We've only got a minute and a half left. Do we have a question for any of our panelists? Any jurisdictions we haven't covered that you'd like our panel to shed some expertise on? Don't be shy. Shout out a country. PNG.
Haven't heard anything negative in PNG. Again, geologically very prospective. You do have a lot of companies operating there. I think you've got one company here listed on the ASX. The Chinese are heavily involved there. Again, I think, Indonesia and Philippines have shot themselves in the foot over the last few years. So certainly there's an opportunity for countries like PNG, even Myanmar, Laos and Vietnam are two other countries. You've got some interesting projects in those countries as well.
In Cambodia, obviously, and we've recently had one of their first mine sort of start to be built over there.
I think with all of the jurisdictions that Bhagesh mentioned, it's really, are you plugged into the thought leadership of the country, and are they trying to encourage this sector, and not just by rhetoric like, oh, we're open for business, please come, but actually in matching what they say with how they do, and are they taking a viewpoint of incentivizing from the standpoint of streamlining regulation, having a go-to person who essentially reports to the president, that we're doing these things to encourage, making sure that there's not going to be, moving the goalposts in year 5 of a 25-year build-out process. I think, again, this all goes back to my earlier comments of, from a capital standpoint and, exploration and mining, people need certainty. And whoever creates that certainty, regardless if you have to do a local 51-50 partnership, it's that certainty which makes capital feel welcome.
Fantastic. That's all we have time for on this particular panel, but if you are interested in entering any of the markets that we've mentioned on this panel, I would suggest that you come and have a chat to our panelists about that. There's many years of expertise here, so thank you very much, gentlemen, for your thoughts.